So I'm going to continue here of my reading, reflection, commentary on chapter 26 of the Proverbs. We have made a quite significant detour into chapter 1 of Genesis. And this was necessarily so because of the verse in chapter 26. Perhaps I should go back to it now. Excuse the pause. It was a 2-verse segment that reads, "He that hates dissembles with his lips, and lays up deceit within him. When he speaks fair, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart." And the reason that I went to Genesis was because of this 7 abominations. I felt like I had no context, I did not understand where I was, and so I had to go back to the 7 days of creation, for this was the logical place to go. That the number 7 in this context seemed to make sense. There was a solid backing behind it. Each day has a symbolic significance. And I felt that if we can build or expand our idea of the heart through each day of creation, and then find ourselves looking at the flip side, the inversion of that, and discuss the abomination of it, we would probably come to a solid understanding of what this verse might be pointing towards. And so far we have. Well, so far I think I have. So I happen to be on verse 29 of the first chapter of Genesis. The plan here is to finish this out and then finish the last few verses in chapter 26 of the Proverbs. And God said, "Behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree, and that which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed, to you it shall be for meat." So this verse, although it may not necessarily be symbolically novel in terms of what we have already been exploring, I think there are a few patterns here that are important to recognize. Thus far, we've already sort of been exploring what it necessarily means to be given the earth and to steward it, and for the man to be the governor of this place. But what is interesting is that there's a repeating pattern of the word being said, and that being followed up by some physical manifestation. And this is something that really only catches the eye, or rather catches the mind, because of the broader discussion that I've been having, and that we have been talking about a broader information landscape or information environment that has some first cause, that within this landscape that there is aspects of the information that is devoted to a particular type of organization, that being purposeful, meaningful information. And then there's another type which is focused on, in a sense, procedural, but not restricted to the procedural, meaningless, but not completely meaningless, as in void of some comprehensive structure or organization. But it is inanimate, it is purposeless, and it is the marriage of the two that gives us life. It is the marriage of the two that allows this saying on the part of God When I say saying, there's a series of verses that have this pattern, and God said this, that, and the other, and then is followed up by, so God did. And it is within that doing, certainly in our case, in the case of our perception, that doing is the thing that requires the information below, which is that inanimate material, the material that is without purpose. It is given purpose by the Word. And God said, Behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree, and that which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat. And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creeps upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. So another interesting part, an extension of this pattern that we have been talking about, that in the first instance there is the Word that is followed up by this consolidation of the waters above and waters below, the material to give rise or to give substrate or binding or form to the purposeful, meaningful information. This is followed up again by seeing, a type of awareness and attention to that which is created, that which is formed. Now, before I wrap this up, I think there is another reflection that I would like to embark on. This is an exercise I've done before. I've done it many different times throughout the Proverbs. I think I've done it throughout this chapter 1 of Genesis. And this particular exercise is meant or is designed to get to a definition of that which is good. Now, just as there are plenty of different ways in which matter can be organized to appear differently, to be composed differently, to be interacted with differently, I think as goodness finds its way down to us, it's often quite similar. That it can be of this shade or of that shade. It can be from this domain or that domain. It can be expressed under these particular circumstances or those particular circumstances. And oftentimes I find it difficult to find one exact definition for that which is good, although there are plenty, I'm sure, that can be had or that can be hypothesized. But it remains to be seen that in our experience, our lived experience, and in our reflections on things, we ultimately come to a broader definition of that which is good. And we have our own examples that allow us to see it. Not that goodness is relative, but that, again, goodness may appear in different forms. Just like if anyone takes it upon themselves to read about the American Revolution, I think it's quite easy, it's quite readily apparent through the letters of the Founding Fathers that the state of liberty in general, is something that is akin to a spirit. It is something that moves over us, around us. It is something that is not material. It requires quite elevated material substrate. That is, layers and layers of modification and of heavenly principles that are drawn down into those layers, that then affords the ability for the Spirit to rest upon that place. And to be a little bit more specific, let's say we imagine some basic material. Let's say, just as a beginner, that this material is inorganic. There are plenty of inorganic materials that we use in building structures. There are plenty of organic materials that we use in building structures. I think of wood as one of those. And even within this short description of the difference of the potential materials that we can use in building, we find ourselves within one state elevated from the other. That is, let's say in the case of concrete, there's nothing organic about concrete, but it is made of different materials that are ground together and is activated by water, and it solidifies and it hardens. And it's something that we can use, or bricks is another example, but it's something that we can use to build a structure. A structure has a particular purpose. It can be used for many different purposes, but the fact being that a purpose is drawn down to occupy that space that is of a material substrate. That material substrate of the building is elevated above the base material that the component parts, the component elements, were once constituents of. When we get to the level of wood, when I say that this is a step above because we're now using life to fulfill our purposes. And wood it can be seen in a sense as a material, a building material, which it is. But it's a step again removed because it was once a living thing. So that in and of itself has gone through this process of taking simpler, less purposeful components and building upon this in some direction as the tree sees fit, as the cells within the tree see fit. And we can go farther than this. We imagine the building. Now we have to imagine, well, what purpose and how ought that building to be organized? So we go through our various plans, we design the rooms, we furnish it as we see fit. And let's say this building is a government building. So it is meant for a particular purpose. It is meant for some civil responsibility. There are plenty of different civil responsibilities that are out there. Some more important than others, I suppose. But let's say this one is fundamental to the civil structure. Perhaps this is a legislative assembly. Now thinking about this in the context of the American Revolution, if we are building a legislative assembly, we are gathering together information to discuss particular topics. But within this space, what is being formed and what is being built has many different, both potential, future, but also current aspects of the material world that have yet to be modified or changed to adapt to or to reorient itself to political changes. And it is based on the deliberation that is within the assembly. And let's say, since we're talking about the American Revolution and we're talking about the spirit of liberty, what is being designed is an institution or a series of institutions, an agreement through which we can all understand and make sense of that thing that is liberty, given the moment. Of course, a couple hundred years later, just as an old house, if we are to open up a light switch and we find the wires that are behind the light switch frayed and understandably old, weathered, we find in the contemporary era a similar sort of thing. And it's not for the wiring or the cables themselves. It is because of the expanse of time. It is because there has been bureaucratic bloat. It is because there has been corruption. It is because there has been changes to the culture of the United States that now what liberty is, maybe I should mention before I get here, that it's changes to the culture, but also economic changes, market-based changes, technological changes. The context, the landscape is now different. And those old barriers, the boundaries that they had once placed to make sense of their liberation from the state of England for their particular injuries, for their particular purposes. Our age, even though their experience affords us quite an interesting view of liberation and of liberty, our age undoubtedly requires updates in order to keep those pillars of understanding surrounding liberty, such that man can continually orient himself to that thing, so he can understand it, so he can make sense of it. In a like manner, I perceive goodness. And so the question is, what about this type of goodness can we appreciate? What about it, like the American Revolution, can we take as something that is perennial, a principle that we can add to our definition? So in times of doubt, perhaps we cannot find goodness, or there's something that we are not quite sure is good, that we can go back to this principle and say, with a confident sense, that something is good or not. So what about this sixth day? What about the pattern of this day can we say is good? Now there are different things that we can identify, like the creation of man, about the word that is finding itself within the material substructure to support something. We could think about man's position in the hierarchy of information that has developed. And it seems that it is not just one thing that is considered good. It is the course of the day that is considered to be good. But this trajectory is what I find interesting. Exactly where is it pointing? I've mentioned earlier in the previous episode, and also alluded to it on this, that what appears to be happening is an interesting and yet bizarre undulation of the consolidation of information with this simultaneous multiplication and reinforced again by a sense of unification. But it's more than just that. It's more than just the undulation, in and out, in and out, and in and out. It is in and out, but also in the upwards direction, in the sense that the information as it consolidates is not consolidating for the sake of density. It is not consolidated for the sense of more material things, like more earthly bodies. It is consolidating and integrating with the two types, with the purposeful and the material, the purposeful and the purposeless. And it is drawing that substructure up to a level that is approaching a certain relatedness to God, a certain relationship to the first cause. And I think that that relationship has to do with similarity. But it's not bound in similarity, for there is difference. Man is not God. And yet man is made after God's likeness. So there's a certain quality or set of qualities that are similar, that cause that relationship to be. And we're not exactly certain what that is. It could be self-awareness. It could be consciousness. It could be just the level of understanding, the level of awareness. And so of information in general, we have the consolidation and the approximation of the two types, but then also the completion of the circuit in the image of God, the representation of that likeness. A sort of continuation, a propagation, like a seed that is planted in some soil, that then grows into something that is new, not the same as the first, not the same as the first cause that had dropped the seed, but similar in likeness. But the most important question at this point is, well, if it is to be true that seeing goodness in this sense requires there to be a more robust relationship to the first cause, then we cannot necessarily say that because man exists, and because man is different than the experience he finds himself in of life and of material, that he is now, in some sense, in the image of God. For surely all types of life have some degree of reflection of God's presence. Even material ought to have this mark of first cause to it. And so what we mean is a matter or degree of likeness. A matter or degree of likeness that is not restricted, then, to man. We can easily imagine an entity, an agent that is above man in terms of awareness and ability. But being on top of the hierarchy ought to be seen as a blessing. To have at one's disposal all of this productive energy on the planet, including all of the life. That despite the fact that there may be agents out there that surpass man, the place that he finds himself in, whether or not he be in a state of agentic adolescence, is beside the point. The matter is, he sits atop the immediate environment that he finds himself in. And because he does so, he has the authority. He has the power. And this authority and this power, I would have to imagine, is quite similar to God, that sits atop of it all. Some creative agent that possesses the very essence of thingness, that is so integrated with being that the matter of life and death and consolidation of informations, these processes have either already occurred or never necessary to the maintenance of the existence of that thing. And perhaps a better analogy, correcting the one that I had used earlier about God's action as planting seeds for agents of his likeness to be born, it is not quite like a tree that drops a seed for another tree to be grown in some area that is proximal to it, but rather it is much like an existing tree that grows a new branch. And this new branch reaches out into the sphere of the unknown, the sphere of the unconscious, the sphere of that darkness. And it turns on that light of life. We don't know if that limb is going to survive. It is premature. It is adolescent. But it has the opportunity to continue its growth. It will continue its growth if it understands where it is, where its place is. And if it dies, no matter, it will be understood and recognized by the central being of what has occurred, and a new branch will grow somewhere else. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all the work which God created and made. These are the generations of the heavens and of the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord made the earth and the heavens. So the remainder of this, I would like to talk about the ending of the seventh day, that of the concept of rest, and then, of course, get back into the identity of the heart, establish that pillar and its significance, and then flip it, invert it for the abomination. So the seventh day, God rested. The first verse in chapter 2 of Genesis is interesting also. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. That is the host of the heavens and the host of the earths. And now I think that this is easy to attribute to mind, to planets, and to everything that is around the planets. Perhaps that would be the heavens. But this is quite a material explanation. I don't think it really helps us all that much, truly understanding exactly what is being said here. So the heavens, this tool of God, this mechanism, this spiritual mechanism, if we will, a mechanism that separates. It separates by identification. Again, it is something of a tool that is used by the principal cause. I don't think we have really much to go on to suggest that there is this autonomy of the firmament or of the heavens. But even if there is no mention of it, I suppose we can imagine a scenario in which the firmament has some sort of agentic quality to it. I suppose it's neither here nor there. But again, this firmament, this tool, this heaven, it serves as a place of division, but it's a division not to separate for the sake of separation, but for the sake of identification. The first example is the separation of the waters above from the waters below, two different types of material. Of this, we have, in some sense, my mind considers the firmament to be the hand of God. It is something quite interesting in the imaginations, in the experience of the development of reality, that this firmament is there. But also, again, much like a tool or much like the hand, it is not the principal driver. It is just that mechanism through which the purposeful apparatus flows. And this firmament separates so that God can act. And in particular, once we have the waters above and we have the waters below, we have this congregation of material, sort of the sandbox of God, if we will, that his hand has separated out this vast array of information, the vast array that is to be used in the basic building blocks of life. This is the Play-Doh of our experience. And then on top of it, the conceptual realm for which the Play-Doh would be shaped into, and eventually the fine interweaving of these to produce life and to produce the agentic arena, in a sense independent of that first cause, the pot maker. Then as the process unfolds, much like a machine and automation, there is this learned sense in which the firmament is given these lights. First it is given light just in general, to divide the day from the night. Again, two qualities that can be attributed to both types of material. Qualities that are, in the sense of the day, light brings us perception, it brings us awareness. And in the sense of night, we have this area that seems to be absent of awareness, but it's not just absence for the sake of absence. There is material there, there is operations taking hold, but these operations are fueling the identity below, if we will, or it is the sub-architecture that supports the identity above, which would be the light. The sub-architecture of darkness we can think of in a layered sense. If we call our principal identity to be the thing that propels us forward, it is our will, it is the words that, the direction that causes these words to flow out of me and into the microphone. And yet I have this entire substructure, much of which I am, in a sense, responsible for, but also the individual actions of all these various processes within my body I cannot control. This is my sub-architecture, but still a part of my identity. The body is quite important. So the light is quite heady in nature, and the darkness is quite bodily in nature in that regard. And then the firmament is given this governing apparatus. It is sort of an extension of natural law that would continue to propagate life, that continues to bestow awareness to that potential that gathers into the agentic arena, and that can eventually add to this conceptual domain. It is not just pure darkness, it is the light of mind, the light of life. And so when we get to the second day, the first verse in chapter 2, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them, I can't help but to think that this implies, well, it can imply a number of things. In our situation, from our perspective, I imagine this as a play that repeats itself over and over and over again until it, or perhaps as it finds a conscious being, an entity that is aware, the production of the agentic arena somewhere. But again, much like the branches of a tree, the branches, and especially the sub-branches of a main branch above versus one below, will have very little relationship to the ones below by their separation, by their degrees of separation. But they still permeate out into the space. And perhaps within this domain they eventually come into contact to form and fill in all of the gaps, unlike an actual tree where it just sort of branches out into the air and has a fixed, stiff sense of things. Perhaps in the information arena, as information extends out into whatever that thing is that it can extend into, perhaps the night, which would be a material substrate, perhaps not material in terms of what we would be able to perceive, but material enough, as in information, consolidated or not. That perhaps in this situation, the branches of the trees, as they reach out, eventually, perhaps some fail, some don't, but eventually there is this gradual coloring in of that expansion of the day, of light, of awareness, of being. So it's an interesting idea, at the very least. And on the seventh day, God ended his work, which he had made. And he rested on the seventh day from all his work, which he had made. So here, I'd like to talk about rest. A simple enough word, but perhaps not immediately appreciated, especially on this scale. Because it's quite easy to go into the kindergarten adolescent mind and pull up an image of God that is like a man that lays in his bed to rest after he has done a solid day's work. There's some relationship here, obviously, to our own experience, but at this level, we have to remember where we are coming from and follow that interpretive lens. And so rest in this way needs to be reformulated, because we don't necessarily understand the true nature of God. It's just something that we can temporarily identify by tracing back information from our own experience to a likely first cause. And so this rest is another matter entirely, because what we have to understand is that it's going to reverberate throughout all of these layers and levels of reason for which we have connected one step to the other. And so there has to be continuity in this definition and interpretation. So although it may seem quite simple and straightforward, I want to look at the etymological chain of the word rest, and perhaps also of the word relax. So from English origins, we have a term meaning rest, bed, repose, sleep. From Proto-Germanic, we have a word giving us meaning of rest, again, pause, repose. The root often carrying a sense of stopping in place or pausing. From Proto-Indo-European, we have to stop or to remain. And so here's where we get into this idea of relaxation. Of Latin origins, we have a verb which means to loosen or to stretch out, to make less tight. This idea that what rest and relaxation does to us is it loosens something. In our own experience, I think this can take us quite far. If we imagine, well, what exactly are we loosening? Not in the material sense, that's interesting in and of itself, but in terms of our experience, in terms of how the heart feels it and the mind reasons it. Rest seems to be something of a necessity, that for our own experience, this building up of energies and of productive potential is only short-lived. And we have to have this period of depressurizing. Now, for an organic being such as ourselves, I'm not really sure, just as much as the adolescent conception of God that finds himself in bed, that this is enough. There's something more fundamental about rest. And this builds up to a cosmic scale that would need some thinking to unravel. So from a conscious point of view, and removing material, although material is quite an important piece of this, because within the natural structure of things, the way that we are formulated, the material that our consciousness lives upon, exists as a sort of machine, an imperfect machine, but a machine that has certain requirements, certain limitations. And this is a physical ability, and of mind, and of position, of authority, of power. All of this is restricted by our physical place. We're also afforded quite a lot based on our physical manifestation. But this is one layer of that onion, and quite a superficial layer, I would have to imagine. But if we are to trace our own organization back, that we are made of light and darkness, we are made of the waters above and the waters below, the base, non-purposeful material, and the purposeful, directed human identity. For us to go to rest is not necessarily a cessation of mind in the absolute sense. It is not necessarily a cessation of organization of information, both of that submaterial and of the high material, of the heavenly material. That continues to exist. Now, there's a way in which we can describe death as a type of relaxation, but this is another level. This is a level beyond of what I'm considering here. I'm thinking of the traditional daily rest, 8-hour daily rest. Perhaps we'll find ourselves at death in a second, but so back to what I was saying, our restful periods are not restful in the sense that the material dies, but that the material is separated and reconstituted. It is not given to that governing structure of the firmament to work on us in that way, in terms of separating our identity into something else and reconsolidating it. We're not at death. We're at the point prior. But if we are to say at this level, at this microcosm, that perhaps that there is something like a mini-death that occurs, we still have to identify and consider what exactly that might mean. And why it's necessary, moreover, in a spiritual sense. There is this sense of replenishing when we speak of relaxation. But much like the idea of reducing tension or to loosen something, the question becomes, well, what exactly are we doing to reduce or release tension? What is that tension? And what is that thing that seems to run out, that needs to be replenished? It seems like it is a divine thing, and it's a special thing. When I find rest, true rest, I'm entering into it from a particular place. My interface with the world becomes less orderly, more disorganized, partly because my mind cannot wrap itself around information like it once had. That because of the expression during the day, because of the movement, there is this period for which I need to return and to replenish something. Now, sleep is an interesting thing because as I think about this replenishing or the releasing of tension, we'll get to the tension in a moment, but at least in terms of the replenishing of something that was exhausted, in this situation, we do find a heavy material basis for this. But it's significant in the symbolic domain. Because it would seem that without rest, assuming that the constraints were the same, that we just didn't wake up and continue forever in that state, but assuming that the mind continued to unravel and the days continued to pass for which an individual had not had rest. I'm sure we're all somewhat familiar with the reports of the people that do this. They begin to see things, they begin to hallucinate. Their relationship to that which is distorts. Their place, their identity, becomes confused, again disorganized. I'd have to imagine that after a long enough period of not sleeping, the confidence for which I speak into this microphone, that solidification of identity and of purpose, that binding force would be quite weak. And I have to wonder about why that is. I'm not sure I can get to a solid conclusion now, But it is something interesting to consider, especially in the broad landscape. If we consider the first cause to be this trunk of the tree that is giving rise to all of these beautiful branches of life and agency. And as these things extend out, they both find themselves moving into a space of disorganization, but also requiring to return back to a fundamental sense of reorganization and of normalcy. Again, this scales. It must scale. Now, the sense of normalcy is important to the identity of the thing that extends out into that unrealized information. If it finds itself completely dissociated or separated from it, the memory of it, the awareness of it, will be completely destroyed, in a sense. It's a type of hell, to be lost in the expanse. But what does this really say, and I'll get to death in a moment, about us and about our experience? About where this conscious mind finds itself on that march of agency, of awareness, of thingness, into this place that it seems so desolate from an individual perspective. On Earth, we have this sort of global awareness at this point. But then as we look out into the cosmos, it seems so hostile to our existence. I suppose here is another good physical symbolism of moving out into that unrealized potential. Of course, in the human context, there is only so much that we can actually utilize, and that requires a really consolidated form of water sub B, or waters below. What I find fascinating is the physicist's account of unrealized matter throughout the universe that occupies the most of it, the dark matter, dark energy. But that's an aside. It really doesn't help us on our journey to really understand where we are in this interface. So here I return to this idea of relaxation as, in a fundamental way, relieving tension, loosening something. And so the question then becomes, well, what happens to the mind such that there is this metaphorical tension placed on it? And that if the mind continues without rest, the tension increases. And as the tension increases, because of that pressure, the identity begins to be disorganized, much like the previous example, an analogy of sleeping as something that is replenishing, that fills us up again with something, sort of a reconstitution of mind, a reinvigoration. And so again, this tension, just as I can take off my sock and I can pull it apart, at some point, if I pull hard enough, and that goes for any material substance, if I pull it hard enough, it'll separate. In the case of the sock, there will still be quite a lot of material to identify what it is, but its purpose will be destroyed. And so there's an aspect of its identity, a fundamental aspect of its identity. It cannot fulfill its purpose anymore. That is completely gone. And much like this with the mind, in the absence of rest, the unfortunate, or fortunate, depending on how we look at it, realities of our experience, and I think of all consolidated bits of information that find themselves out here in what appears to be this desert, so far away from God, except in our own hearts. But in our awareness of of concrete material, and even our awareness in our hearts, we find it difficult to find our way home outside of natural law and unique instances in human experience that are too infrequent compared to our general awareness of things, the material things. And so, if we extend this sock analogy to the mind, I think of my mind. If I extend it enough, my attention begins to wither, my goals begin to decay, my concept of self erodes and becomes something that is difficult to hold on to. It is like a man that is shrinking in significance in the face of a hurricane. That his own mind becomes the hurricane, and that little aspect of self that is formed by millions of interconnected neurons begins to flicker like a UV switch before it turns on, except the flickering is in the opposite direction, like it's about to go out. The man is thinned, the pressure too great. His identity won't survive. And so there are a lot of thoughts that circulate in my mind about this potential, what this might mean for life and death, the seventh day of return, the seventh day of rest. And I have to wonder about God, about the expansion and the return to that principal identity, the layered structure that must be. My mind thinks about an image, a rather flexible image, one that is clear, and there's an ebb and there's a flow to it. It appears almost as a spider web. Layers of spider webs that are interwoven, that are breathing in and out. And there's a thread between them all that connects them, that is responsible for them. But I don't wish to create some profane image. So I'll leave this commentary on chapter 1 of Genesis as it is. We surely will return to elements of what was explored here in the rest of the Proverbs. But going now all the way back to chapter 26. We are on verse 26. We just finished 24 and 25. Whose hatred is covered by deceit, his wickedness shall be shown before the whole congregation. And I believe that this is a follow-on from 24 and 25, which reads, He that hates disassembles with his lips, and lays up deceit within him. When he speaks fair, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. Whose hatred is covered by deceit, his wickedness shall be showed before the whole congregation. And so let's begin again here. It's almost a bittersweet thing to return to the Proverbs after spending a little bit of time in Genesis. It's nice to return. I feel like I'm coming back home in a certain way. So let's talk a little bit about this word, hatred. I've come to understand it in a few different ways. Firstly, since we have been talking about the heart for some time, hatred is in a sense a product of the heart. It is not without reason, but it is a strong, intense experience. It's passionate. It's a dislike for something, for someone, to loathe, to despise. These also ring true. But passion, the orientation of passion, is something that I find interesting. That within this word we find another sense of intensity. But it's more fundamental in the sense that what it means is that it is strong and barely controllable. When I say it, I mean an emotion. And unlike hate or joy, it doesn't have this direction to it. It is just a base level of intensity, passion. And certainly where the passions are directed tell us quite a lot about where our feelings go in the positive or the negative direction. Towards productive or counterproductive ends. In a like manner, there are these two main aspects of mind that I have been considering. That of the rational aspect of mind, and that of the heart, that of the emotional seat. And part of me wonders if I should substitute the word reason for the word logic. So it is more logic and emotion. Whereas in the emotional sense, the bedrock of that are raw emotions that are produced because of something. But the becauseness of their production may not be realized. They may not be oriented or connected in a way that is sensical, rational. There are plenty of times throughout the day for which I find myself feeling for no particular reason. And I find it difficult to go through this process of justifying, of making amends to my heart, for saying to it that what you feel is just a part of life. It's not wrong. It's not right. But there's a direction that we must go, regardless of how you feel. If we move in this direction, the feelings will change. The soil is richer for a productive experience. And of logic, I think of that framework or that structure for which the rational aspect of mind, the aspect of mind that follows or that utilizes this architecture, using evidence, logic, rationality. But as I reflect on it more, I think of reason yet more fundamental than logic. That it is something, at least of our faculties, that may pre-exist our structural development of logic. That we can come to some sense that intimately is involved with our emotions prior to some formalized process or procedure that we might call logic. But perhaps there may be some that recognize where I'm going with this. Since we have come off of our experience in Genesis, we can use a particular pattern that might be useful for us here. That when we see one thing and another that are separated, and yet are also understood to be one whole. We have the waters above and the waters below. The one thing I'm uncertain about is if we can reliably draw a parallel between the waters above to one aspect of this, to that of logic or of reason, and then of the waters below to that of the emotions or whatever. I'm not sure we can do this. But I think that we can imagine the action of the firmament coming to us here, and the separation of the human mind into these components. Again, the seat of our feelings and our desires, but also more of a structured way of putting together information, that it requires certain thoughts, sometimes seemingly independent of emotion, in order to come to some strict equivalence or formulation that strongly adheres to some principle or premise. In the logical sense, I think the form that this affords us is an aspect of behavior that wishes to be, at least momentarily, independent of our heart. But again, exactly where this unifies and exactly where it is split by the firmament, I still struggle with. So let's work through this a little bit. I think what is important here to start with is a statement or some proposition. So the first statement will be that there is something in mind called both the heart and reason. And of particular focus or particular concern, I'm interested in this reason. It's difficult to start here because it doesn't seem like there's an adequate proposition, an adequate statement. What I'm after is that fundamental bedrock that underlies reason. And I think this must be experiential, at least for my part in understanding it. And so I may find myself engaged in this experiential exercise, that is, reporting a particular situation that I've gone through, and then finding myself in a dialogue about where that reason is, how it is used, how I can conceptualize of it. But for the moment, I wish to follow a line of thought. That when one chooses to understand reason, the first thing that I consider is direction. And the second is attention. Now I say direction because in order for something to be known, for conclusion to be drawn, there must be this movement from one place to another. again, from some premise or starting place to some ending, some end goal, some end place, for which we might call a conclusion. But what exactly determines where we end up? What kind of relationship is there between where we begin and where we finish? What is of the mind's desire to find something to be true? Now, thinking about the ways in which something can be true is quite daunting, and also, I think, impractical for the present situation. But reasoning, keeping in mind the starting point, point A, and the conclusion, point B, is this dynamic process. It involves thinking. It involves that journey that I had mentioned. It involves the agent that is moving through this space willfully. Every step of the way, there are moments at which the agent is perhaps tempted, conflicted, confronted by the option to be honest or the option to be deceived. To accept that which flows, and here we would say logically, because it follows some law or some form, some structure, by which our steps are supported. That in and of itself an interesting thing to conceptualize, that there is this architecture of logic that the mind can rely on to understand that which is true. Let me explain an image that is in my head. I often find this image, for whatever reason, and I return to it. But I am a fan of camping, and I especially enjoy the trails at night. For whatever reason, there's an aesthetic quality that I like about it. There's an aspect of risk which I find interesting. But the path at night seems to be all the more obscured than it is in the daytime. And it would seem that going out at night, hiking at night, adds to a certain intensity of experience. And the image that I have in mind is this trail. There's an image on the podcast that represents this, I think, quite well. There's a trail that is illuminated dimly by the moon. And I find myself in this scenario, in this image, hiking through the trail. And I'm trying to find something. My mind doesn't really seem to know what it is looking for, but my heart seems to understand what it would take to satisfy it. Kind of a strange approach to something. At the bedrock of it, I would have to wonder. I have to imagine that there's some existential drive that causes the mind to be so burdened by curiosity and for some sense of understanding and satisfaction. But regardless of my existential insecurities, there is a belief, I think, that flies under the radar. At least, in my initial conception of it, my initial conception of this illustration, the story that is unfolding, where I find myself in this darkened wood hiking, trying to find some place that I don't know, nor do I understand. And I suppose I could have taken a much easier analogy or illustration, but this is probably the most difficult I can think of, because our premise is not anything solid. There may be many premises that come up throughout the hike, like the necessity for water, or for shelter, or perhaps there's something dangerous in the woods. And because of the obscure nature of the environment, it is difficult to come to some conclusion about what is lurking in the darkness. And so there are plenty of situations, in the absence of the overarching purpose, to use reason to come to certain conclusions. But I think that the reason I chose the insecurity of journey, or perhaps the lack of understanding of the journey, is because in life I find myself in this situation. Not that I don't have purpose, but I always find myself thinking about maximizing my purpose, trying to reach certain goals and to fulfill certain things, perhaps so as to satisfy a feeling, perhaps so it is to find exactly how I ought to sacrifice, how I ought to be. But diving down farther into a journey that seems to have no end, and yet there's a belief that there is an end, is in and of itself, I think, where we must attend. And this is because the belief is the bedrock of reason. That one must believe that there is a way to come to understand something. In this case, an existential dilemma, or some overarching purpose of life and of fulfillment, of productivity. If there was no belief that questions could be answered, then that pursuit, from the very small to the macro, for which I mentioned the existential, would be meaningless, because there wouldn't be any true answers. But we believe that there are answers. There are plenty of answers that I am looking at in front of me. The microphone is an answer. There are plenty of problems that were addressed and solved in the process of manufacturing such a device. Many things must have been understood to produce such a device. It's similar to the book, the light, this computer. Everything is representative of this process, however small or however large. Now, I hesitated to make this analogy earlier, but now it comes back to me in a way that seems to make a little bit more sense. That perhaps logic, or what I'm conceptualizing in my mind as a natural law for which an agent can identify and climb up the scaffolding, as it were. The scaffolding would be considered logic, and the climb would be considered reason, because there are certain principles, there are certain foundational principles that support reason. Now we could say that reason becomes before logic, because of the nature of mind. The nature of our mind. But we trace this back to the first cause. It would seem that logic and reason begin at the same time. But in my situation, my reason and my attempts at such things as thinking and problem solving, the scaffolding is always there. I climb up on it. Perhaps I slip, I stumble, I come to false conclusions, I get some things right. This side of mind, the rational side of mind, it certainly seems that considering the procedure, considering the journey, and considering what we take along with us, our subjective experience, our own identities, again, the heart, the seat of our emotions and of our desires, just as easily as our reason can lead us to falsehood, some emotion can lead us to a false sense of things. Now, consolidating is a difficult business. I give it to God and I give it to the firmament for such an image. But the image that I have in my mind, that was begun with the story of hiking in the woods, there appears to be this information landscape in which, again, the overarching purpose, the overarching experience is quite chaotic and scattered. There is no consolidation of purpose or of information in this situation. And as I think about the firmament as it divided the waters above from the waters below, I think about this chaotic environment. I think about disorganized, purposeless material and disorganized, purposeful material, in the way that my illustration about walking in the woods without purpose is illustrative of meaningful information without a strong direction or consolidation. But the firmament, as things progress, is able to organize information, organizes the waters below into things that are better building blocks for the higher heavenly, agentic, minded experience. And much in this way I think about logic. I think about the principles of logic. Now this is forming, of course, in a different domain, because both of logic and of reason and of the heart, this is all of the domain of mind. And so we're talking about the principles of creation as it finds itself within the mind, and not just the material world. We're sort of microscoped in, if we will, a few segments, or a few units of magnification. And so this firmament, as it continues its action, I think what we find is a consolidation of information, both information that comes from the heart and also information that is produced by reason. Again, I want to reiterate that somebody can reason incorrectly, just as somebody can feel incorrectly. And it's a matter of following the architecture, following the right path, so to speak, that will lead one to an answer. Now, in order for information to be consolidated, it must have common direction, and it must follow sound rules. Now, why are the rules important? Why can it not just move in the same parallel direction towards the same end, the same goal? Well, if reason, and the same of feeling, was not able to be drawn down to a conclusion, and it just existed in a chaotic sphere, then the agent would not be able to realize what it sees. The attention itself would be, and the identity itself, would be so disorganized that its grasp of reality would be insufficient to recognize a potential solution. And so I think by this there has to be a mental architecture that governs, dictates in a way, but not in a tyrannical sense. It dictates in the sense that natural law, in the material sense, dictates. From my own experience, if I walked out onto my balcony and I jumped off, there is a likelihood, given my height above the earth, that I would perish because of it. Now, just because that is the situation doesn't mean that I don't have will or have a degree of agency. It means that I must follow a particular way to preserve my experience. And I think this is true of the material as of the minded domain. And just as the minded domain meets the material domain in life, I think the heart meets reason in purpose. I think the heart can find truth, and the reason can find truth independently. But in their marriage, they find purpose. So let's for a moment talk about this architecture, this mental architecture. The principles of logic that serve as the foundational rules that guide valid reasoning to ensure consistency in thought, argumentation, the acquisition of truth. And these principles are, or ought to be, universal. So of the first principle, we have the principle of identity. A thing is identical to itself. A equals A. I cannot be myself and also my cat at the same time. A triangle cannot be a circle. The second principle is the principle of non-contradiction. This is a statement cannot be both true and false at the same time, and in the same respect. So taking this word contradiction, I think about taking a statement or an idea, and in my bizarre, cartoonish mind, the image that I think about is these two identities coming to arms and combating one another. or that there is this insurmountable barrier that exists between them because they cannot occupy the same space. They physically cannot occupy the same space. Or metaphorically, formally, cannot occupy that same space. It can be said that it is snowing, and it happens to be the case that it is snowing right now. It can also be said that somewhere else it is not snowing. These two things are not opposed to one another because they are afforded a certain position, a certain space for them to exist independently. Now, if I said that right now it is snowing, right now it is not snowing, that would be a contradiction. Either it is snowing or it is not snowing. The two cannot exist together, same place, same time. So for logic, there must be a principle of non-contradiction, so we don't find ourselves in this bizarre place. Most of us wouldn't find ourselves here. I'd imagine it quite strange if a person did not have this logical principle installed in them. The third is the principle of the excluded middle. This is a statement that is either true or false, but there is no middle ground. Every proposition must have a definite truth value. My pen is rectangular. This is false. It is not rectangular. My pen is circular. We could say that it is in a way circular, but then that way would have to be defined. My pen is long. In order for that to be true, it would have to be compared to something. Or it could be a pen that is longer than average. But what's easy in this case to tell about this principle of the excluded middle is if my pen is open or if it is closed. My pen is closed. My pen is open. There is no middle ground between the two. The fourth principle is the principle of sufficient reason. Everything must have a reason or a cause. Nothing happens without a rationale, and every true proposition has an explanation. If the car won't start, there must be a reason. I think there are interesting ways in which we can discuss logic, the framework of logic, that may allow us to see these principles a bit differently. And I think at some point in my exploration of the Bible or of Plato, I'll find myself there. But that is a far deeper discussion than I'm willing to go now. And before I move on, I want to say that I understand that I'm going into quite a strange rabbit hole, but I think this is necessary. The conversation of the heart and of reason, and given that we have just come off the heels of going through each one of the days of creation, and we've been discussing the intricacies of each day, and how this relates to the identity of the heart, and how expansive of an image this is. When we return now, we are prompted, as we always are, to think about the mind in these terms, in terms of the feeling-driven, the desire, the root of our desire, our feelings, that of the heart, and also of our rational mind, if we will. All of this is fundamental to our approach, I think, in our relationship to God. The better we understand ourselves, not in a selfish manner, but the self is considered, the self is experienced, the better we understand this experience, I think the better we can trace ourselves back to that first cause, come into closer contact with it. And so my whole purpose of doing this, of diving so deeply into something that seems mundane, whereas in my view it seems fundamental, just beginning with the word whose hatred, something so simple, leading us down this path of discussing the fundamental principles of logic, is necessary. For how else are we going to adequately understand this relationship, or just in general, the identity of the rational aspect of mind, as opposed to, or as related to, the identity of the heart, which is an aspect of mind, and then of the whole, which is one singular identity. And I'll say this before I move on. The separation is good as a snapshot to identify different components. But the separation is not a separation for the sake of separation. It doesn't operate in two component parts. It operates in tandem. Much like our gait doesn't operate on one leg. It requires two legs to ambulate. Of course, we could be missing a leg and we can undergo a process that is similar, but true ambulation, in the normal sense of ambulation, requires two legs, requires two functioning legs. And the normal human being, for that agent to be a traditional human being, it requires these elements of the heart and of reason, and the strong relationship between the two. Almost the inseparable relationship between the two, the governance that unites them. So returning back to this, the principle of causality. Every effect has a cause. Logical relationships often involve casual connections that can be explained. The window broke because the ball hit it. So how does this differ from the principle of sufficient reason? Well, in order to approach some cause, in order to identify it outside of pure luck, we have to have something that is tethered to it in a way. It's easy to imagine something that is physically tethered to something else by a string, some physical attachment. But expanding it out, as the mind can identify relationships between things, the mind forms this almost abstract sense of a physical tethering. And so there must be a way to explain why the car won't start. If the car doesn't start, we don't just say, well, that's it. The car's new identity is non-starting car. And that the identity before somehow is inconsistent with this new condition. There must be a reason for this added state. But the car is still the car. The fact that it won't start has a reason. The battery is dead. The battery died, so the car did not start. The principle of causality. Quite related, but I suppose necessary on some level to give a distinction between them. I'm going to quickly run through a few different laws, just so we have them stated, and we can refer back to this if needed for whatever reason. So we have the law of transitivity. Logical relationships follow a chain of connections. If it rains, the ground gets wet. If the ground gets wet, plants grow. Therefore, if it rains, plants grow. The law of modus ponens. The truth of a premise leads to the truth of its conclusion. If it is snowing, it is cold. It is snowing, so it is cold. Keeping in mind that the premise is fundamental here. Because we can just as easily say that, at least in the previous example, if it rains, the ground gets wet. If we didn't have the premise of if it rains, the ground gets wet, and we just said that if the ground is wet, well, did it rain? No, not necessarily. The ground could be wet for many different reasons. But the premise, if it rains, the ground gets wet. If that is true, then the ground is wet because it is raining. The law of modus tollens. If the outcome of a premise is false, the premise itself must be false. If it is raining, the ground is wet. The ground is not wet, so it is not raining. The law of contraposition. The contrapositive of a true statement is also true. If it is a cat, then it is a mammal. If it is not a mammal, then it is not a cat. The principle of logical equivalence. Two statements are logically equivalent if they imply each other. Statements can express the same idea in different forms. All humans are mortal is logically equivalent to if something is not mortal, it is not human. So back to what we were talking about before, about this reason. So we have an established structure of logic now. And honestly, regardless of what the structure is, I think it's just useful for our conversation to know that there is this structure to follow, that it provides us with some degree of consistency and some reliability. The principles in and of themselves are much like natural law. They don't really tell us much about meaning, but they tell us the way of things, and the way that things make sense, the way that things are connected together. And I think that this applies as much to the heart as it does to the rational aspect of mind. But the question would be, well, how would it be for feelings to follow logic? Well, if I feel sad, am I depressed? And the answer is no. Not every time am I sad because I'm depressed. If depression is to mean that this is some protracted state of consciousness, such that my mental state is constantly subdued by sadness, or by some fundamental lacking. Sadness can come about because of a whole range of experiences, a whole range of causes, many of which may be temporary, and they don't last. And so in this way, we find ourselves feeling logically. Now, thinking about feeling follows a logical process, but feeling logically obviously follows feeling. It's not as though that our feelings are producing rational thoughts, but they are producing a rational experience, perhaps I should say. A rational experience that can be seen by our reason. And so it's hard to separate the two because they're so interwoven and connected. And in most cases, it's not necessary to separate the two. But this brings me back to this idea of the firmament that finds itself within our minds. And I'd like to draw the attention back to the idea of Genesis and the separation of the waters above and the waters below as a macrocosmic event. The days of creation and the separation of the waters from the waters can still occur as a fundamental pattern of our experience. And I think that examining it on the microcosm is just as fruitful as we have experienced in navigating the pillars of the heart. So let's round out this conception a little bit more. For the firmament to be separating the heart from our reason. Again, it is not separation for the sake of separation. There is a necessity, in some sense. There's a necessity for the physical substrate to have a degree of independence, to have a degree of structure and order, in order for the mind to be this physical object that penetrates into a domain, a dimension. When I say dimension, I mean a way of seeing or an extra set of tools to experience or to relate to an environment. Perhaps that's not a good definition of dimension, but I don't mean by dimension that it is some alien world that, how should I describe this? I have the conception. There's this superficial conception, I think, that floats around in our culture about the idea of what a dimension is. That it is this, in some sense, it's a hidden realm. And here I find myself thinking, well, there are plenty of things that are hidden to the mind. Despite its experience and its existence, much of the physical world is hidden to it. But also, much of the formal world, of the world of mind, is also surely hidden to it. But it is not a portal to a different reality. The reality is as it is. What illuminates that reality is the dimensions through which a being can measure or attend to identify whatever it is that reality is. So if we can experience in 3 dimensions, we have the physical sensors to pick up on the information in the environment that it affords us 3 different dimensions. We have 3 spatial dimensions. We have the X, the Y, and the Z. Everything that we understand about physical space is measured in these 3 dimensions, or at least in our physical sense. and we perceive these as shapes, volumes, and distances. We are afforded this sort of thing through our perception. Visual input, proprioceptive input, orientation to gravity. And of course, movement, we move in these dimensions as well. And interaction. As I manipulate this pen, it is within all three of these dimensions. If somehow there was another dimension, or rather I should say, if there was another set of faculties that allowed the human being to perceive another dimension, another layer of measure, another area of interaction, then our experience would be altered. The way that we take in information, the way that we see things would be different. We would be afforded more information. And I wondered for some time how exactly I would square this idea of talking about the firmament and the lights that are bestowed within it as a governor, and what that would mean, and how it would mean something that wasn't just completely arbitrary. That there would be some good sense to understanding a process that occurs in this way. But now that I think about it, just as I think about a governor that governs a populace, about the various responsibilities that that singular person has, responsibilities that no other person are given or bestowed, but are necessary to the regular functionings of a civic body. And in this way, on a cosmic scale, the broad civic body, being that of matter itself, or even of that of reason, of sense, all of these fundamental components are necessary building blocks to a conscious agent's, a self-aware agent's experience of life, a sense of their own identity. So this brings me back to this intense aversion towards something, whose hatred. For all of the ways that we can consider something to be incorrect, for all of the ways that we can consider something to be correct, I want to draw our attention to the wellspring of a feeling that can come from the heart. And if we ramp up this wellspring, we find ourselves at a certain level of intensity. The pressure is high. But as I said in the outset, we don't quite know, just based on the degree of this voluminous expulsion of feeling, exactly where it goes. It is a microcosm in and of itself to think about this firmament here, that there is this unconsolidated mass of feeling that is being consolidated and governed into a particular place, directed by the agent, but undergoing and operating upon this way, this principle of coming to be. So today is a new day. A new day brings new thoughts. Now, I'll come back around to that previous theme. Lately, there has been plenty of diversions, enough to distract my attention from the topic at hand. Perhaps the diversions are necessary to fill in gaps as necessary, but it can often lead to a difficulty at finding a continuous through line and some purposeful, impactful interpretation that I can take with myself and incorporate it into my life. Sometimes the larger image is difficult to consolidate. Whose hatred is covered by deceit. This hatred. So we have an expression of the heart, an intensity, a wellspring that has burst forth. It is consolidated. We can think about it in terms of the days of creation and the microcosm of the firmament bringing together this wellspring of basic fundamental feeling from the heart, basic intensity. And of course, this has to be married to our reason. It is married to our reason as the meaningful, minded aspects of our experience or of reality in general are married to material, base material, non-purposed material. Now there's issues that I have with that statement, but for now I'll leave it. And so we have this strong emotional underpinning that is capped off by some reason, some thought that directs it to dislike, to loathe, to despise. So in our mind's eye, we take this expression, we take this event, like this volcanic eruption, and then we imagine, all of a sudden, that it is covered by something. A strange thing to do, it would seem. Under what circumstances would we cover something? I imagine covering something when I want to hide it. I imagine covering something when I want to protect it. I imagine covering something when I'm ashamed. But often I find myself thinking about covering in a physical sense, like I'm putting a tarp over a pile of wood or something. But in the context that we are speaking, this hatred is not a pile of wood. That is not a physical thing. Of course, it could find itself a home in the material world, but we're thinking about this conceptually. We're thinking about this in the formal domain. And so to cover such a thing, an expression, some reason, what it requires is something of the same mold, of the same waters, of the same type of information. And so what I see this being covered by is in some sense language, which is a transmission of meaning and of value. That there is some thought process that comes over this expression and shields it. Of course, it covers it, it hides it. But much like the physical analogy, when I think about the tarp in and of itself is, I suppose, purposeful. There are many different types of materials that one can use to cover a physical object for many different reasons. This book, for example, is covered in leather. It is meant to protect it. But it's not the same material as a tarp. A tarp is generally waterproof, plastic-type material. The components of my computer are covered by a metallic surface, a casing. to protect those delicate inner pieces. Regarding myself, the skin is covering my internal organs, my muscles. It is something that provides protection, a barrier. In the minded domain, I find it a little difficult to switch my mind from thinking about physical materials to conceptual. But nonetheless, I think about this hatred again, this intensity of heart, and married to some reason. And I think about just as in the type of material that can cover something for whatever purpose, I think of a concept that can cover this thing for some purpose. And so there are two things I think that need to be explored here. The purpose of the covering, and then the cover itself. Now thankfully, in this verse we understand the cover itself to be deceit, which is fascinating. And I think, much like the principles of logic that we talked about before, we can determine exactly what the purpose of the covering is by the nature of the cover. Again, going back to the material analogy of the tarp that is covering wood to keep it dry, I would not cover a pile of wood with a cloth material because the water would seep through it. Now, deceit is an interesting word. It is a type of hiding. It's an action by which somebody is misdirected. Their attention is turned away from the thing that is covered. The covering misrepresents what the truth is. Here I think about Lord of the Rings, when Frodo, or when Sam falls down the mountain and disturbs a bunch of rocks, and there are guards that come up to see what the noise was, and in order to conceal Sam, Frodo himself jumps down to where he is and covers him in this sort of magical cloak that gives the appearance of the surrounding area, and it conceals them, sort of misrepresents the truth that is actually there. I suppose the question that we have to ask, the question that we've been coming to, is, well, why exactly, or for what purpose, perhaps more importantly, would someone take such an intense experience, that of hatred, and cover it with something that is meant to cloak it, to deceive the person that looks upon it? If I wish to be concealed from sight, it is because I do not want my whereabouts known, that I am perhaps doing something that is nefarious, that requires the absence of awareness of my presence. And another thing that I was thinking about that we have to keep in mind, this verse is in a relationship, a close relationship with the previous two. He that hates dissembles with his lips, and lays up deceit within him. He that speaks fair, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. Knowing that, and knowing what it would mean for creation to be undone, a perpetual darkness for which the sun never rises, the morning never comes, for which there is a perpetual deconsolidation of information, never to be reformed or renewed, now expired, obsolete, absent, void. For someone to have such a heart, either knowingly or unknowingly, in the manner in which we mean, I find it fascinating how, in both situations, the known and the unknown, in terms of how this hatred would manifest and penetrate into that space, whatever it is, under the cloak of deception. I think to myself about this racing bullet. Where is it going? And of course, this verse doesn't offer that type of information. And my mind doesn't hunger for the mind, the particular mind that it finds. My curiosity hungers for how this verse completes itself. And so the second half reads, "His wickedness shall be shown before the whole congregation." And so by what instrument does this racing bullet for some unfortunate target be disempowered, in the sense that its deceit is the main driver, the force behind its penetration and effectiveness? But here we can enact one of our principles of logic. Which one is it exactly? I don't know. All I know is that there is a through line, that there is some sense that can be drawn from where we have been to where we are now. What do I mean by that? Well, this deceit, in order for it to be uncovered, must mean that there is some way of seeing and understanding, such that deception itself would find itself unfolded at a certain point. At the point where deceit can no longer survive. At what point is that exactly? But I would imagine that it must involve several minds, in the sense that several minds have the ability to recognize different aspects, to see different parts of the whole. But given a certain boundary, given the reach far enough into a particular age, into a particular lie, into a particular pattern of behavior or story, there are times in which there is an apparatus set up for which the environment does not afford hiding places. We should all hope that we find ourselves in such illuminated environments. But I think we all understand what it means for a lie to be wrought up, for there to be walls placed up at every corner for which a lie cannot hide, it cannot run. That the truth of not just one, but of many, in this sense the congregation, see it for what it is, and can examine it in detail. And when the covering is laid bare, or unfolded, what is underneath is that hatred. That hatred, of course, is a symptom of an underlying pathological heart. That underlying pathology, of course, is the abnormal or the distortion of the 7 pillars of creation. And as I think about this now, and I reflect on my diversion, I think there's much of that detour that still needs to be uncovered, fixed, modified. Even as I reflect on it now, I think about this heart. I think about my heart. I think about the way in which my feelings can contribute to the orientation of my attention. And I think what a battle it is for when one understands that there is this domain of feeling, that one can feel more deeply as well as think more reasonably. That path is often fraught with difficulties. Things that are on the path that I'm unaware of and cause me to stumble and to trip. Things that distract my attention. Things that I come to accept as my own undoing, at least at times. Accepting responsibility is no easy task. It's easy to do in the conceptual landscape. It's harder to do in practice. But I suppose the conceptual and that which is in practice is nearly the same thing, for at least for it to be true. And the truth is such a fascinating thing. It is something that exists independent of our desires. The truth is something that can be found by one or by many. It is something that can be covered by ourselves, to ourselves, or by one to another. There is this strange relationship that the collective has to the truth, and the pull that the centerpiece for that truth contains within it, the power that it contains within it. I think of a leader, a king, a president that has so much cultural momentum built up behind them that they become almost a symbol as much as a human being. And although the human being is not infallible, that at least there is hope in effective leadership. What I find interesting within this landscape and all its possibilities, and again, reflecting on my own experience, my own heart, I wonder at our will. I wonder at our desires. I wonder about that maintenance of the identity and its fracture, or at least potential fracture within. Now what I'm getting at is an internal lie, or a conflict for which something that is being expressed by the heart, it could be hatred, it could be whatever, that it is covered by something. And of course, the way that we overcome this is by saying that we have the ability to say no, and we are stronger than whatever it is that seems to be covering the truth, or whatever it is within the heart that seems to be covered by deception, by false promises, by superficial goals, by an absent mind. This is a difficult verse for me, and I suppose it's difficult in a number of ways. It's difficult in the sense that in order to understand exactly how the person who has this hatred that is covered by deceit, how exactly it will come to light. And the best way to do that, of course, is to involve the subject and the experience. And that means for myself and for whomever may be hearing this in the future, that what we are prompted to consider is some of the deepest aspects of our experience, perhaps the most painful. Perhaps it is opening a door that we did not necessarily know existed. Perhaps it was grown over, covered over by complacency or by time. There is always something there in each one of us. But for my part, I have found that environment. I found the door. Initially, when I walked up to it, I was afraid to even touch the handle to turn the knob. I knew what was behind it, but for some reason the door, kept closed at that moment, gave me a sense of security that it wouldn't open itself at some point later. But I've been confronted to open this door. I've gathered the courage. I've put my hand on the handle. I've turned it and opened it. And what came out was what I expected. What came out I could recognize through reason. But what came out was something that I could not control. It was not something, perhaps I should say that it is not something, that is meant for any person to control. It is something that needs to be surrendered. Surrendered in the sense that a person or a group of people, again, are engaged in this conflict, this bitter conflict. And the only way to preserve that fundamental experience, that existence, preserve life, is to say, I stop, I give up. The fight is over. But uncovering the deceit, it is not satisfied with just surrendering, as if one were to surrender to an enemy. This is not the type of surrendering that would be sufficient to redeem the mind. And so the question is, again, back to where we were, how do we find a key? How do we find this key in the sense of unlocking the deceit, such that it opens the truth of the matter? But as I established, surely we all know the matter of the situation if we just take a minute or two to think about it. There is a way for it to come to light, whether we choose to recognize it or not. The role that I feel that I play in my experience is I find myself almost the centerpiece, the front stage of this cosmic pattern that is playing out. That is playing out in all of us, this experience of consciousness and self-awareness. But all of the specific details that are the concern of a particular individual. This play has a particular style, that is a particular narrative that is my life. And the way that all of this finds me, and the way that I relate to it, of course, is my own decision. What happens to me, there's a fair degree of it that is not my own doing. It is something that I cannot take responsible for. I don't have the authority or the power to claim that I can alter all of reality to fit my goals. But there are things that I can do to change my condition. My will is not limited completely. There is freedom of operation within the given constraints. And of that which I recognize that I am free, I see that I am somewhat of a mediator between a certain sense of the light and a certain sense of the dark. I think that we all have aspects of both. Perhaps they manifest in certain ways. But at times I find myself thinking about agents that find us, that disrupt our attention. And I often think about the tension within my own mind of reconciling that possibility with the individual failure. That there is something deeply rooted within the individual. That even if the rational mind is committed and desiring of something, whether it be an aspect of the heart or perhaps even an aspect of the rational mind that still has not given ground, that the predominant value that is espoused by the king of the mind, let's say, does not actually have the type of authority that it thinks it has. But in either case, it becomes a matter of self-organization, of self-governance. And it's interesting, I feel like, how much this applies to the individual as it does to our collectives. I believe the mind can change. The style of governance can change from one period of life to the next. Within these periods, there are true regressions, and I would say true progressions. And that in both situations, not that in the sense of Genesis, moving from the day to night and from the night to day, always has to do with good and evil, because I don't think that's the situation. I think there's an element that we can draw some association between a difficult time in life being a time of darkness and a good and productive time of life being bright, full of light in the daytime. And undoubtedly, these experiences that find us falling or rising will have some mechanism. We'll be able to identify what is happening. The problem that I have in both small and large situations for which I have difficulties or struggle with, internal struggles, is how much of this is coming at me from such a world and such a realm that I cannot comprehend. Again, it's a force, it would seem, that's well beyond anything that any man has any ability to control. But as far as the will is concerned and its participation in that experience, sometimes I find it so odd. So odd at the things that it will do to reach certain ends. In every direction. And the will, constrained, perhaps by itself, or by its allegiance to all that is good, I think the latter is really the only way. The allegiance to all that is good is the only way that truth or sense can be done. It is the only way that one can follow any structural or logical hierarchy, or perhaps not hierarchy, but like scaffolding, to understand something that is true, to uncover that deception, and to bring it to the light of the congregation of one's own mind. Whoso diggeth a pit shall fall therein, and he that rolls a stone, it will return upon him. So the first part of the verse, whoso digs a pit shall fall therein. Now in the physical sense, this is not where we need to be, because I can just as easily dig a physical pit and mark where that pit is and not fall into it. I could fall into it by accident, I suppose, but it's not a surefire guarantee that I will. In the minded domain, I find this a bit more curious about where the pit is, exactly what it looks like from a psychological perspective, or from a symbolic perspective. And this is really going off of everything that we talked about thus far. It's part of the beauty of the Proverbs, how there is this continued thread through the whole of it, while some verses may not seem related at all. And so in the past 3 verses, we're talking about a person, well, more than 3 verses, but we've been talking about this person who is the antagonist to the 7 days of creation. And what that means in practice is that creation is undone. Information is spun apart. Sense, common sense, logic, all of these things are unraveled in the mind of the person that has their heart corrupted, that has this abomination of the heart. And so when they speak, instead of filling language and filling the environment of the human collective mind, with things that are good, again, things that are productive, things that bind, things that create, instead there is this air of destruction, and again, unraveling and unwinding for the sake of it, of returning it back to a state where none of it could be possible. And so to dig a pit, I think, is to dig a pit within the mind that is so psychologically inescapable that a person has difficulty recognizing and orienting their attention in a sufficient manner to be productive. So they are indolent, essentially. And he that rolls a stone, it will return upon him. Sort of the karma narrative that's so commonly espoused in our culture. And there's a beautiful verse here that says the same. What goes around comes around. Now this image of the rolling stone, it brings up an image of the individual, myself as I read this, the potential for starting something, putting something into motion. That, much like a stone that is put into motion at the top of a hill, it would necessarily have to be if it's going to be rolled, unless it's thrown or given some great force behind it. So this rolling stone is set off by my action, my behavior, my inattentiveness, and it is now causing a sequence of events, a chain reaction, if we will. And much like the kinetic chain in the body, if one segment is limited, the load, the stress will be given to other aspects, more proximal or more distal. And so I think there are plenty of practical ways to think about how the stone would come back around, not in the literal sense, well, not in the physical sense, but it would come back around in the sense that, unlike in the woods, where we can unleash some causal operation, some causal pattern, perhaps we throw a rock or move a branch, and that causes a couple branches to break, or maybe we unleash a blockage in a creek and that reroutes water, whatever the case might be in the physical domain. Consequences here remain relatively low. Now, of course, there can be quite serious physical consequences, like on a construction site, for which we place something somewhere or move something, and then that causes something else to happen, and then a person gets seriously injured or dies because of it. That is approaching, I think, what is meant here. But much like digging this pit and impoverishing the mind from understanding, this rolling stone is like a seed that is planted in the mind, even though the consequences of our rolling the stone seem to be secondhand, that we are not responsible for it. But the pattern and the image that we see, that we understand because of that, I think is enough to integrate it into ourselves, such that either we accept what we did, and either we choose to change, or we choose to double down and to continue with such behavior. And so for the stone to come back around, I don't necessarily think that it is always this negative thing, that what goes around comes around saying. I think it could be much more insidious, that if a person does something, let's say, and they get away with it, they don't have to take responsibility for their action, what will be ingrained in them is this sense of acceptance, that responsibilities do not actually need to be held, and that it's just a matter of what one can get away with to satisfy their own ends. Of course, the probability of having this type of person run into an unfavorable situation is high, especially given enough time. What I'm concerned about is the mind and its relationship to this way of thinking. The way of just laying down to something and saying that it is acceptable just because nothing has happened that has been immediately negative. First, there are plenty of things that may not immediately be clear to us that are the cause of our illness or our ailments or difficulties. And it's a matter of purposefully searching them out, finding the problem like one finds a leak in a pipe or a hose. The person that doesn't wish to recognize that there is something wrong is the person that will not be able to understand how to fix it. And so I feel like the stone can come back in this way as well. A lying tongue hates those that are afflicted by it, and a flattering mouth works ruin. A lying tongue. The tongue, again, the physical representation for that manipulation of speech, the speech being that medium through which value flows. So much like our hands are that physical representation of interacting within the physical environment. As I move my hand out forward, I'm picking up my water bottle and I'm placing it back down on the table. In a like manner, the tongue within my mouth is manipulating the sounds so that I can convey information, a message into this microphone. There are many things that I can do with this water bottle, just as there are many things that I can do with this tongue. And the ability to think and to consider information is very valuable. It can disrupt places of authority. It can alter power. It can move power. It can deceive. It can bring joy. It can bring laughter. There are all sorts of ways that information can be organized by the tongue. But in its unfortunate actions of spreading darkness around a known source of light, so that they can manipulate another person's orientation to that light, and only open a window, a small sliver of light, so that the person would be drawn to it because they believe that it is something that makes sense, or that is within reason, or that it is good for them. The person that does this is often interested in something else. I think of many situations here. I think of the politician. I think of the drug seller, the drug dealer. I think of the individual and the internal deceit that happens to avoid responsibility. In all cases, there is this inflation of self, or of a particular aspect of self, a barrier that is erected at the face of truth. Now, I think that there are two roads that we can explore in farther detail. A lying tongue hates those that are afflicted by it. So the person that is doing the lying, they can either hate the person that is downstream of their lies because they are susceptible to it. This is more of the sociopath or psychopath. And then there's the other situation, which might be also intertwined with this, but I imagine also the situation of the individual hating others that express this lying tongue or use the lying tongue when they themselves use it. And this has to do with that internal deceit, lying to oneself and saying or expressing a sense of self-righteousness that they themselves do not practice. And I suppose that there are a number of different reasons that this can come to be. What is most likely is that the aspect of self that is doing the lying is really split in some sense. That there's another aspect of the person, of the individual, that believes that lying is wrong, and that when they themselves partake in this behavior of lying, of manipulating, it is because they can't control it. It's just a part of them. But if anybody else is to do it, then they are to be deemed as irredeemable, as less than. Another reason, perhaps, I'll have to think about the times that I have told a lie and draw some conclusions from that experience. There's one that I told recently that I'm rather ashamed of. As usually I try to make it a point to be honest, but every once in a while, for whatever reason, a lie will come up. Maybe I'm ashamed of something. Maybe who knows what the motive is. But sticking with the analogy that there is this beacon of truth there, that maybe somebody is asking a question, or however the attention is oriented around a particular concept or thing, this then becomes our beacon, whatever the center of attention is between the two conversing parties. The analogy is that the lie spreads this darkness around that beacon of light. What is left open, of course, are partial truths, so that the lie can be effective. It can deceive the actual body of the truth. The body of the truth is different in its fundamental identity than that which is exposed or observed on the part of somebody else. And I think back to this situation, and I think that the lie in my case, in the most recent case, came from shame. And I have to ask myself, if I found myself in a situation where somebody was to lie about something, and I expressed an anger or a hatred towards this person, how exactly would that manifest? I think what would be most likely, what I would be most angry about, is a result of my own ineptitude, my inability to give up my shame, to sacrifice it and say, this is the situation. This is the truth of the matter. It is almost as if I'm watching myself if I witness somebody else do the same, and I know for a fact that it is a lie. Outside of just having a contemptible attitude towards lying in general, the particular experience of covering one's own at the expense of truth, I think is immoral. Now, I readily admit that I am a sinner and that I I lied, and I should make that right. The lie wasn't the biggest deal in the world, by the way, but I should not give myself excuses. It is still something that happened, and it is something that is not right. And so I found myself again in this territory of imagining all the different possibilities about why a person, and it depends on the person's disposition, why or how a person would see another person interacting with their lie. Again, there's a sense of internal judgment. There's a sense of anger that a person cannot find themselves given that kernel of truth and break their way into the confines and understand the whole by some process of reasoning or deduction. I think, again, this might be the more sociopathic, psychopathic experience, where they disdain the person because they were so gullible or inept that they could not see the truth. That their affliction is a weakness, and that weakness is not something that is pleasurable or desirable, whatever the case might be. And a flattering mouth works ruin. So what exactly does it mean to flatter? Well, if we look at our etymological chain, it has its origins in Middle English, but it can be traced to the Old French and Germanic influences. In the 13th century, the meaning of the term was to praise excessively or insincerely, often to gain favor. And so there's a component of lying here. The lying tongue still exists within flattery. In the Old French, we have a word that means to stroke, to caress, or to soothe. Often implied actions that are meant to appease somebody or to pacify somebody. Again, there's this sense of lowering one's guard, or their reasonable guard, let's say, the guard of reason, so that they can have their way, so they can take advantage of the defenseless. From the Proto-Germanic, from a term we have the meaning flat or smooth. The word is flaz, F-L-A-Z. Suggests a metaphorical link between smoothing something physically and soothing or pleasing someone verbally. Now, in the modern sense, we have this excessive praising of somebody that involves an error of insincerity, and it's often used to gain favor or advantage. But there's also the secondary sense, in which the words are used to make someone feel good, pleased, or honored, and it can be in a genuine sense. That there may not be this hidden motive that is behind it. But of course, given that we are talking within the context of lying, the lying tongue, this type of flattery is an extension of that. Another thing that we have to consider in this verse is the distinction or the difference between the tongue and the mouth. Because in the first instance we have a lying tongue, and in the second a flattering mouth. So we can take the two symbols to mean the same thing, that the mouth is this tool or apparatus that is designed to manipulate speech. But within the Proverbs, we often have these symbols: the lips, the mouth, and the tongue. And I can't help but to think that they are all related in some way, but have a slightly different meaning, a symbolic meaning. And what is also related to this is the degree of agency that is described to both of these things. In the first instance, a lying tongue hates. We don't think often that the tongue is a separate agent that is doing the hating. And so the conceptualization of this experience, I think, has to be different. Now, what we see here is an emotion, hate, emotion tied to reason, of course, but there's this strong intensity of the heart's production. A lying tongue hates. And so there's an aspect in which the tongue as a symbol, I think, is tied to the feelings of the heart, or the product of the heart, the desire. And so, similar to what I mentioned, that the tongue, in the physical sense, is this object, multifunctional, but in terms of meaning, it manipulates speech so that we can articulate words. Without it, our speech would be quite diminished. But for it to hate, again, there is this attribution of desire, that there is this deep-seated, fundamental truth that is associated with the tongue's speech. That the desire of the heart is wound up within the value of the words. And of course, if it is a lie, the value of the words would be quite minimal. And if the values of the words are quite minimal, then it would be difficult to value that discussion, a person that is taking in that information, or of a person that is speaking in that way, in terms of limited information, or valueless information. A flattering mouth works ruin. This seems to be working is more of a physical connotation. And here I want to pause for a second and share a thought that I had before I started today. And this had to do with my continual, at least my perceived continual, swinging to and fro philosophically. I think at times, although I don't believe myself to be a Cartesian dualist, I express a lot of these tendencies. And I think it's partially because of the age that I'm living in that I find this something to revert to. It's sort of something that has been installed in my mind. But I don't necessarily wish to restrict myself to that sort of thing. I do think that there is a close relationship between mind and body. And although I refer often to a substrate of material and a substrate of mind, I ultimately think that of all of it, it is a matter of the degree of organization of information. The breaking up of the waters into the waters below and waters above, which I've thus far been describing, I think inaccurately, as of the waters above, that of meaningful, purposeful, minded information, conscious perhaps, and that below, which is more inanimate, purposeless to a degree, although it follows natural law. there's nothing really in Genesis that says that the waters above are this minded type of information. Everything below includes both the minded and the material, again, breaking up into those categories. It seems sufficient that there is a difference between the two, that it sometimes is useful to use the categories, but it certainly wouldn't stop there. The point that I'm trying to make is that the waters below include the creation of the physical structure, but also of all of life, including man. And so if that's the case, then the waters below are certainly capable of producing meaningful information, purposeful information, when organized. And there's a broader question about, well, what do the waters above do? Are they different in character? Are they different in kind? It's hard to say. Now perhaps I'll come back to this, and there will be elements that I may salvage, but this is something that I'm working on now that I don't quite know the answer to. Now I say that because when I see the second half of this verse, "and a flattering mouth works ruin," I'm attending particularly to the word work. And there is this implication that the mouth is a mover. It is more of the load-bearing symbol of our expression. The mouth is still something that articulates speech. It transmits language and thereby value into the broader world. But working, I think, has material, physical implications. That the value that is within the words are transmitted into the earth, into the earthly. And it is by this that causes, or that translates, information from a conscious agent down to the material world. And in this case, it ruins it. It could be any number of things. I think about the contemporary United States and the various psychological pathologies that have plagued us, that we seem to be combating at the present moment. Some people would call it woke, but often the description of woke is not sufficient to describe exactly what is happening. But nonetheless, the consequences of this, I think, have led to many unfortunate physical realities, whether it be the cheapening of our structures that we choose to live in. Often houses that are built these days are built cheaply and marked up at a price that is unreasonable given the quality of the housing. We have infrastructure decay, which is the result of planning and of the broader philosophy, I think, that permeates the culture and of the political class. And the question is, well, how exactly does flattery lead to physical destruction or disintegration of something? And I think it has to do within this idea of deception and of covering the truth. For if the truth is not allowed to be understood or seen, or if it is manipulated such that only parts of it are seen, participation with the truth is going to necessarily be altered. And everything that depends on good sense, proper organization, is going to falter. It's going to fail. And that has obvious underlying physical realities to it. So I think I'm going to stop here. Now this concludes my thoughts and reflections on chapter 26. And I want to say something in closing. You know, this chapter was a bit different. An interesting experience in the sense that I went back to Genesis. It brought to me new ideas. It brought to me a broader vision, but also some confusion and some doubt. And it has me reflecting further on this experience, the general experience of the religious motivation and of the religious discipline. And that the farther down one digs, or the farther out one builds, maybe we can say, there will be these areas, territories for which navigating, understanding is going to be difficult, and answers will not come immediately, and there will be mistakes made. And I think that, for my part, what I want to say to myself, and perhaps to any unfortunate person that finds themselves this far into this episode, it is not a matter of the failure of the way of things. It is a failure of connecting fundamental pieces together such that they flow and they are continuous. They make sense. Now, I can't say that there is something glaring that I've said that doesn't make sense, but there are, I think, weak chains in that chain link fence that need to be explored in farther detail. The one about the waters above and the waters below would be an example. But despite difficulties, this should not be cause for the troubling of one's faith. For even if things appear quite differently in the grand picture as compared to the grand picture that we build for ourselves in our mind, the faithful person will accept how it is, will accept the truth, and adapt accordingly. So this marks the end of this episode. I'll continue next time with chapter 27, verse 1.